Hello everyone, welcome to the AI and Industry Application track. My name is Mina and I will be your host for today. We begin this track with the presentation from Arthur Jansen, data scientist specialist at Dun & Bradstreet. He will present to us how his company uses machine learning to help companies get a better visibility of their supply chains. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Jansen.
Does it work? Yeah. Just let me present my whole Serbian knowledge first. Dobar dan. Now let's continue in English. So the subject of my presentation will be how at Dun & Bradstreet we have used machine learning and data science to help our customers to get a better visibility on their supply chain. So first I would like to start with a typical example we face in supply chain. So I guess most of you know Taiwan is the world leader in semiconductor manufacturing. And a lot of Western companies buy the most advanced semiconductors from a single Taiwanese company. So in December 2021, when a huge flood occurred in Malaysia, flooding its capital, Kuala Lumpur, it shouldn't be a big risk for these Western companies because Taiwan and Malaysia were thousands of kilometers apart. The only problem is that this single Taiwanese company had a single supplier in the world for its packaging of semiconductors. And because of the flood in Malaysia, this Taiwanese company couldn't send their semiconductors anymore to Western companies, and Western companies had to shut down several of their factories and lost millions of revenue because of it. So when we see this kind of problems, we can try to understand why did it happen. So the first problem here, the biggest problem, is that these Western companies had a single suppliers for something as critical as semiconductors, if they had to shut down their factories because of it. The second problem here is that they didn't really assess the risk of this Taiwanese company because they didn't really knew that climate disasters in Malaysia would affect the Taiwanese supplier. But they are not alone because this is the usual view a company sees regarding its supply chain. They usually know their direct suppliers, so what we call the tier 1 suppliers, but it becomes blurry really fast when we are talking about tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. Actually, from a recent study by Geodis, also in another company working in supply chain, only 6% of companies have a good visibility on their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And the problem is that often disruption in supply chain arrives from tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers. So we came to the fact at Dun & Bradstreet that companies need a better visibility on their supply chain to proactively mitigate the risks. And that's why we have created a B2B supply chain product to help these companies get a better visibility and to help them to proactively replace risky suppliers if needed. So our B2B product is designed around a 3-step process. The first step is to identify. So the identification of the supply chain network of the customer. Here we call about N-tier supply chain network because we don't only identify the tier 1 suppliers, but also the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And once we have identified the supply chain network of the customer, we can assess the risk of the supply chain, meaning identifying the risky suppliers. And Dun & Bradstreet is one of the world leaders in B2B company data, so we have actually a lot of data at our disposal to characterize these companies. So for instance, we have data like risk scores, so we have different kind of risk scores linked to companies. We have the financial data of companies, like the turnover, the amount of debt. We have the locations, like the countries, the activity codes. So the activity codes represent in which field are they working. Are they working in IT, retail, education? We also have been starting to compute ESG scores. So ESG stands for Environment, Social Governance. And so once we have identified the supply chain network and that we have identified the risky suppliers, we can go to the last step, which is to improve. So the proactive improvement of the supply chain resilience. And we do that by replacing risky suppliers with new potential suppliers. And we find these new potential suppliers using different kind of machine learning models to find the most similar companies compared to their existing suppliers. So that's the high-level view of our product. So 3-step: first, identify the supply chain network; second, identify the risky suppliers; and then third, to replace these risky suppliers. So now I will go through each of these steps one by one to explain them better. The first step is the identification of the supply chain network. So usually in the industry, a top-down approach is used, meaning that if we view the supply chain as a tree, we will start from the top of the tree, so from the customer. We know the tier 1 suppliers of the customer because the customer gives it to us. And then we try to find the suppliers of the tier 1 suppliers, meaning the tier 2 suppliers. The biggest problem with this approach is that companies usually don't want to share the suppliers. They spend so much time to build a great list of suppliers, then they treat this list as a trade secret. They don't want to share it because they're afraid they would lose a competitive advantage. So this is a big problem, and in practice, a top-down approach is really difficult to do. And so that's why at Dun & Bradstreet we have decided to do the opposite and to use a bottom-up approach. Because while companies don't want to share their suppliers, companies love to talk about the customers or the clients for who they work for. And so instead of starting from the top of the tree, we decided to start from the bottom of the tree. So start from tier 3 suppliers, find the customers of the tier 3, so the tier 2 suppliers, and so on. The only problem with this approach is that we don't know the tier 3 suppliers to begin with, because we don't even know the tier 2 yet. And so at Dun & Bradstreet, we have decided to consider all the companies in the world as potential tier 3 suppliers, meaning dozens of millions of companies. And we decided to compute the customers of all these companies so that at the end we could find the tier 2 and the tier 3 suppliers of the customer. And to do that, we had to find a source of information that is shared by the majority of companies in the world. And we found the perfect source of information for that, which is the websites of companies. Because companies love to talk about their customers on their websites. They usually have dedicated web pages to talk about that. So here we have 2 examples of list of references on websites of companies. So what we did is that we first used machine learning models to understand if the web page was indeed talking about customers, so using NLP and transformers. And then we did another model of machine learning to extract the name of companies that were indeed the customers of this company. So if we take a graphical example, so imagine that we have a set of companies. What we did is that we looked at the websites of these companies. Whenever we would find a client-supply relationship between this company and another one, we would have a link between them. And once we have looked at all the websites of all the companies in the world, we basically have all the client-supplier relationship we could find from the website. And so now that we have this graph, it's quite easy to have the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers of the customer, because imagine that this specific company was the customer. The tier 1 suppliers are the companies directly linked to the customer. The tier 2 suppliers are the suppliers directly linked to the tier 1, etc. So that's how we did to find the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers of customers. So now I would like to introduce you a real use case we had in the past. So actually it was the first use case we had when we built this supply chain product. It was with a car manufacturer based in Europe. And the challenge was that based on 200 of the tier 1 suppliers, we were asked to find all the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And so the results we had were quite good because we were able to find several thousand tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers just based on these tier 1 suppliers and just based on website data. So if I talk about this use case, it's because we found out really important characteristics of the supply chain of this supplier. So this is a real example of this car manufacturer. So we had a tier 1 supplier they gave us, and we discovered 2 different tier 2 suppliers linked to this tier 1. The interesting thing is that when we looked at the tier 3 suppliers, we discovered that one of the tier 2 suppliers was at the same time a supplier of the other tier 2 supplier, meaning that the first company was at the same time a tier 2 and a tier 3 supplier. And when we saw that, we started to understand that the supply chain graph of customers might be more complex than just a tree. It was maybe a more complex network. And so because of that, we decided to create a huge visualization for this car manufacturer with the thousands of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers to see if we could find more complex patterns, I would say. So this is a small part of the visualization we did, just to explain how it works. So we have, so each dot represents a specific supplier, and we have the link between 2 dots if we could find a client-supplier relationship on the website. So for the colors, we have the yellow dot, which is a tier 1 supplier, so not the car manufacturer. We have orange dots, which are the tier 2, and the green dots, which are the tier 3. So we can already see interesting facts, like on the left, we can see a bunch of tier 2 suppliers with the same tier 3 suppliers. This is important, for, of course, for risk assessment. And if we zoom out a bit, we can see even more patterns. So we can see a red dot at the bottom, which is the car manufacturer. And this is the final view we had for this car manufacturer with the several thousand tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers. So once we did this visualization, of course, so this graph is beautiful, but it's not the final step. Okay, it was just the first step, the identification of the supply chain network of the customer. Because now that we know the supply chain network of the customer, we can identify the risky suppliers. To identify the risky suppliers, there are 2 dimensions to tackle. The first one is, what is a good definition of risky suppliers? The thing is that the definition changes from customer to customer because they are all interested in different parts of their supply chain. So in the past, with former customers, we had different kind of definitions. These are important ones. So some customers would like to focus more on suppliers in their critical activity areas. So if you remember the first example with the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturer, this is a critical activity area for the Western companies, and that might focus more on this activity area in the future. Other customers were more interested in suppliers shared with competitors. This can also have a risk because imagine that you have a supplier and it's shared with another competitor, and this supplier has to cut down their production in half. What would they do? Will they decide to send half the supply to you and half of the supply to a competitor? Or will they decide to send all the supply to your competitor and nothing to you instead? So this can present a risk for the customer. And then the final focus of customers are the compliance risk and opportunities. So once we have a good definition of a critical supplier, we can enrich the supply chain network with data to find the risky suppliers. So I've already tackled this subject at the beginning, but at Dun & Bradstreet, we have a lot of different kind of data to characterize companies. So here I repeated the data we have. So for instance, we have different kind of risk scores, like bankruptcy prediction. We have several models in several countries to predict the risk of bankruptcy of companies. We also have financial data. So we have the turnover, the amount of debt of companies. We have demographical data, like the number of employees of companies. Does it shrink or does it increase? it's relevant for the risk of suppliers. We also have activity codes of companies, we have their locations, etc. And we also have been starting to compute ESG scores. So ESG for environment, social governance. This is quite important for a risk assessment. For instance, for risk, for environment score, we have climate-related risk. So the risk of fire or drought or flooding of companies. For social scores, we have risk related, for instance, to forced labor or child labor. This is important for customers to know compared to their suppliers. And for the governance risk, we have, for instance, risk related to corruption. This is also important to know regarding its supplier. So once we know the definition of a risky suppliers and that we have enriched the supply chain network, we can identify the risky suppliers. So if we take back the example, what we do in practice is basically we have a risk scores associated to each company, and what we can do next is to find why some suppliers have a higher risk scores. So for instance, this one could have a higher risk score because it's shared with another competitor, or this one have a higher risk score because it presented compliance risks. So this second example is important also because it's a tier 2 supplier and not a tier 1, because as we saw in the first example at the beginning with this Taiwanese company, the problem arrived from a tier 2 supplier and not tier 1. So it's also really important to have the risk of tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. So once we have identify the risky suppliers, we can replace these risky suppliers. And how do we do that? We do it by generating potential new suppliers that are similar to the risky suppliers. So for this, we created a complex model. Actually, I did a presentation on that at the Data Science Conference in Zagreb in May. So here is just a summary of it in one slide. So how do we do to generate new companies that are similar to a set of companies? So what we do is that we take the list of suppliers, of existing suppliers as input, and we will try to understand the characteristics of these suppliers. So how do we learn these characteristics? It's by using data. So we have different kinds of data at our disposal. We have what we call the traditional data. So it's static and offline data. So for instance, the number of employees, the turnover of companies, the activity codes, the locations. We call that static and offline because it doesn't change really often. So the number of employees or the turnover, we have it once a year in the annual report of company. So it doesn't change really often. What we also have is online data. This is much more useful for a good lead generation because online data change really often. By online data, we mean the information that are on the websites of companies. So for instance, we understand what the companies are talking on their websites. It changes much more often than once a year. We also talk about how the news are talking about these companies. So it also changes much more often than once a year. And so with all these data, so with the traditional data and the online data, we are able to characterize the existing suppliers. And once the model understood the characteristics of the existing suppliers, what we do is that we look at all the companies in the world and we find the companies that are the most similar to the existing suppliers. So here, these are the potential new suppliers. And the goal, of course, is once we have the potential new suppliers, we can present them to the customers. So if we take back this example, imagine that the customer really doesn't want to have a supplier shared with a competitor. What we will do is that we will present a potential new supplier that has a much lower risk score than the previous one, and just present it to the customer so they can replace their risky supplier if they want to. So to wrap up what is our B2B supply chain product, It was designed as a three-step process. So the first step was to identify the supply chain network of the company, meaning to discover the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. The company usually doesn't know that. The second step was to assess the risk by identifying the risky suppliers, depending on what the customer is focused on. And then the third step was to propose new potential suppliers to the customer to replace the risky suppliers and to proactively improve the supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you. And Arthur, do we have any questions for Arthur?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about assessment frequency. How often do you have to calculate risk scores, since most of your data is pretty much static during the entire year? So do you use the online data already in the first assessment of the suppliers? And do you have any recommendations on what is the frequency? How many times a year you have to recalculate risks to have some real insight into the risk? Thanks.
So for the risk, we compute the risk for each customer, because actually it depends on the customer and it depends on the suppliers they have. For the online data, it's a difficult balance, because at the same time we want to crawl the websites of all the companies in the world, but on the other hand, it costs money. So we had to find a good balance. It depends on the number of customers we have, but we try to do it several times a year to have the data on website, because yes, the data on websites change often.
Okay, just another, the example you had is the flood in Malaysia. Yeah. So do you also use this kind of weather data, because this is something that could be used in real time, right?
Yeah, so the example was in December 2021, and we have calculating these ESG scores in 2022. So we didn't have it at the time, no.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, now we have been calculating risk of fire and drought and flooding, so it could be used in the future.
Thank you. Do we have any other question?
Thank you. I'm a colleague I'm the colleague from Dun & Bradstreet. I just wanted to ask something, just if you can give some short explanation about ESG metrics. It is something innovative, something which is added value of Dun & Bradstreet, which needs to be heard on this place, at least in some short point, just for you to know. I think this is like a one step to the future, let's say like that. But please, Arthur, just short about ESG metrics.
Yeah, sure. So the ESG metrics is something that is getting more and more relevant because of climate change and climate disasters. So ESG stands for Environment, Social Governance. We have been computing ESG scores to have a better view on everything that is related to environment, social, and governance. We have been selling the ESG scores as it is at Dun & Bradstreet because it's also really relevant. And then we have been adding these ESG scores to our products at Dun & Bradstreet. So for this supply chain product, we had it before computing ESG scores, but we added the ESG scores. We also had other products like lead generation that I talked a bit at the end. This lead generation product has been created 4 years ago, but we added recently the ESG scores.
Any other questions?
Thanks. I mean, it sounds too complex for me. You're gathering too much data. Do you also have sub-suppliers of data, or you gather it all by your own? You mentioned, like, okay, environmental data. How do you assess the risk then? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's kind of too complex. And then finding an alternate supplier is kind of also interesting. How do you find an alternate supplier? Where do you get all that?
So Dun & Bradstreet is a company that is more than 100 years old. So we have been computing this kind of score for a long time. So for instance, for the pretty much all the scores I've mentioned today are based on online data. So by online data, we mean the data we have by looking at the websites. It can be either of companies, of NGOs, etc. And it's by gathering all this data that we can create new products. So for the lead generation I was talking about, we did it 4 years ago. Then 2 years ago, we did this supply chain. And now we are doing these ESG scores. So it's really, these products are creating little by little, but we have been doing for quite some time now. So that's why we have a lot of different products now.
Thanks.
Thank you, Arthur. That will be all for now. Thank you.
Thank you.